A 2-year-old boy vanished from his bedroom in the middle of the night, and within weeks, the one person who should have been searching hardest for him was dead. And the truth about what happened to Trenton Duckett has never been told. Before we dive in, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from right now. And if stories like this one stay with you long after the screen goes dark, subscribe to Missing Case Network, because tomorrow we uncover another case that will change the way you think about the people we trust most. There is a particular kind of cruelty in a case that takes a child and then takes the answers along with them. The disappearance of Trenton Duckett began on a warm August night in Central Florida in 2006, and it has never ended. Not officially, not in the ways that matter. No body recovered, no perpetrator charged, no courtroom where the truth could be tested and weighed and finally spoken aloud. What remains is a case file, a fractured family, a media firestorm that consumed the mother before anyone had proved she was guilty of anything, and a little boy with dark hair and bright eyes who has never come home. Trenton Duckett was born on April 13, 2004, in Leesburg, Florida, a small city in Lake County, roughly an hour north of Orlando. He was the son of Melinda Duckett, who was 19 years old at the time of his birth, and Joshua Duckett, who was 20. By any measure, they were young parents navigating a relationship that had not been built on stable ground. They married, they struggled, and by the time Trenton was a toddler, the marriage was falling apart in the way that young marriages under pressure sometimes do, with acrimony, with competing claims, with court filings and custody disputes, and the particular bitterness of two people who once loved each other and now communicated primarily through attorneys. Trenton, at 2 years old, was the center of all of it. He was a small boy with round cheeks and dark eyes, the kind of child who draws adults in with an openness that toddlers have before the world teaches them to be cautious. People who knew him, family members, neighbors, people who encountered him in the ordinary way that children are encountered in small communities, described him as a happy kid, affectionate, the kind of boy who ran toward people rather than away from them. He was wearing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle pajamas the last time anyone saw him. Leesburg, Florida sits in the rolling terrain of Lake County, a part of the state that most tourists pass through without stopping on their way to Orlando or the coast. It is a place of modest homes, wide roads, strip malls, and the particular flatness of Central Florida that gives the sky unusual dominance over the landscape. In the summer, the heat is oppressive, and the afternoon thunderstorms roll in with a regularity that locals stop noticing. In August of 2006, it was the kind of hot that makes people stay inside in the evenings, move slowly, keep the curtains drawn against the sun. Melinda Duckett was 21 years old that summer. She and Trenton were living with her grandparents, Bill and Carol Eubank, in their home in Leesburg. The arrangement had come about partly as a function of the custody dispute with Joshua. Melinda's living situation had been a point of contention in the proceedings, and partly as simple practical necessity. The Eubanks were steady, older people who provided the kind of stable domestic environment that the court filings described as necessary for Trenton's welfare. Melinda was young and under pressure, and the presence of her grandparents gave the household a ballast that it might otherwise have lacked. Joshua Duckett, meanwhile, was living separately and pursuing custody of his son through the courts. The custody proceedings had been contentious. There were allegations and counter-allegations of the kind that custody disputes generate, competing claims about fitness, about behavior, to about who was better equipped to raise a small child. A guardian ad litem had been appointed to represent Trenton's interests. The case was moving through the Lake County family court system with the slow grind that family court proceedings typically have. On the evening of August 27, 2006, a Sunday, Melinda Duckett put Trenton to bed at the Eubank home. She would later tell investigators that she last saw him at approximately 8 o'clock in the evening, in his bedroom, in his Ninja Turtle pajamas. She said he was fine. She said there was nothing unusual about the night. The following morning, Monday, August 28, 2006, Trenton was not in his bed. Melinda called 911 at approximately 7 in the morning. She told the dispatcher that her 2-year-old son was missing from his bedroom. She said she didn't know how he could have gotten out. She said she didn't know where he was. The Leesburg Police Department responded and began what would quickly grow into a massive search operation. Within hours, the case had the attention of the Lake County Sheriff's Office. Within days, it had attracted national media coverage. A 2-year-old missing from his bedroom in the middle of the night, it had all the components of the kind of story that cable news of that era consumed with enormous appetite. What the Leesburg Police Department found when they began processing the scene was, from the very beginning, troubling. There was no sign of forced entry. The doors and windows of the Eubank home were secure. There was no credible evidence that anyone had come into the house from outside. The bedroom where Trenton had been sleeping was undisturbed in the ways you would expect if a stranger had come in and taken a small child. No signs of struggle, no evidence of an adult presence in the room. What this meant, when combined with the fact that a 2-year-old cannot unlock and open a door and simply walk away into the Florida night, was a set of conclusions that investigators began to draw quickly, even if they were careful about stating them publicly. Trenton had not been taken by a stranger. Trenton had not wandered away on his own. Whatever had happened to Trenton Duckett had happened inside the circle of people who had access to that house. Melinda Duckett was the most immediate focus of the investigation. She had been in the house. She had been the person responsible for Trenton. She had called 911. And in the hours and days that followed, her behavior, the way she responded to questions, the things she said and didn't say, the inconsistencies that investigators noticed in her account of the evening, began to raise serious concerns. The inconsistencies were not dramatic. They were the kind of small contradictions that can mean many things. That a person is lying, that a person is traumatized and misremembering, that a person is young and frightened and not presenting themselves well under enormous pressure. But investigators noted them, and the more they pressed Melinda for a clear, coherent account of the evening of August 27th, the more elusive that account became. She said she had been home all evening. Then there were suggestions she had not been. She gave varying accounts of the timeline. She was unable or unwilling to provide investigators with a clear and verifiable story of where she had been and what she had done in the hours before she reported Trenton missing. Joshua Duckett, meanwhile, was cooperating with the investigation. He was cooperative, demonstrably distraught, and his account of his own whereabouts that night was supported by corroborating witnesses. He was not removed from the suspicion entirely. In any case involving a missing child, both parents are scrutinized. But he was not the focus of investigative concern in the way that Melinda was. The Eubanks, Melinda's grandparents, were also interviewed. Their cooperation was unquestioned. They were an older couple who had opened their home to their granddaughter and great-grandson, and the disappearance of that little boy had shattered them. Searches of the area around Leesburg began immediately and expanded over the following days. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Dive teams searched local waterways. Volunteers combed fields and wooded areas. The heat was brutal. The terrain was flat and sprawling, and nothing was found. Nothing was found. Then came Nancy Grace. In the summer of 2006, Nancy Grace was at the height of her cultural influence. Her program on CNN's Headline News was one of the most watched shows in cable news, built around a prosecutorial approach to crime coverage that its host had developed during years as a prosecutor and that translated, on television, into a style that was simultaneously compelling and deeply controversial. Grace had a talent for finding missing child cases and amplifying them to a national audience. She had done it with the Lassie Peterson case. She had done it with the Natalie Holloway case. She had a formula, and the formula worked in the sense that it generated enormous viewership, even as critics argued that it routinely prejudged suspects, inflamed public opinion before trials had been held, and caused demonstrable harm to people who had not been convicted of anything. Nancy Grace found Melinda Duckett. In September of 2006, just weeks after Trenton's disappearance, Grace's program devoted significant airtime to the case. The coverage was what anyone familiar with the show would have expected. Melinda Duckett was treated in the framing and the tone and the relentless line of questioning, not as a mother cooperating with a missing child investigation, but as a suspect who had something to hide. Melinda Duckett agreed to be interviewed by Grace. It was a decision that, in retrospect, seems like one made by someone who did not fully understand what she was walking into, or perhaps by someone who believed that appearing on national television would help find her son. She was 21 years old. She was under investigation. She did not have media training or legal counsel present in the way that anyone with experience in such situations would have demanded. The interview was recorded in advance of the broadcast date. Grace pressed Melinda on her whereabouts on the night of August 27th. Melinda was evasive, inconsistent, unable to give a clear account. Grace, who had spent years as a prosecutor, recognized the pattern and pressed harder. The interview became adversarial in a way that was jarring even by the standards of what Grace's program routinely produced. On September 8, 2006, one day before the interview was scheduled to air, Melinda Duckett was at the Eubank home. She went into a back room. She took a shotgun that belonged to her grandfather, and she shot herself. She was 21 years old. She died at the scene. Trenton Duckett has never been found. The death of Melinda Duckett sent shockwaves through the case, through the media coverage of the case, and through the broader national conversation about how cable news handles missing child investigations. From one direction came the argument that Melinda's suicide was proof of guilt, that an innocent person does not take their own life when a child is missing, that the inability to give a coherent account of the evening, combined with the decision to die rather than face further questioning, added up to a confession in everything but words. From the other direction came a more complicated set of arguments, that Melinda Duckett was a 21-year-old woman who had been subjected to a weeks-long public evisceration by one of the most watched programs in cable news, that she had been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion before any court of law had weighed the evidence, that young, frightened, grieving people under that kind of pressure do not always behave in ways that investigators and television prosecutors find satisfactory. That inconsistency under questioning is not the same as guilt, that suicide in a person already under enormous psychological strain, we can reflect despair about circumstances rather than confession of a crime. Both of these sets of arguments contain elements of truth, and neither of them tells us what happened to Trenton Duckett. That is the central problem with this case, and it has never been resolved. The Duckett family, Joshua's side, reacted to Melinda's death with a rage that was both understandable and, in its expression, often extreme. They had believed from very early in the investigation that Melinda was responsible for Trenton's disappearance. Her suicide, in their reading, confirmed that belief. In the months and years that followed, various members of the Duckett family gave interviews, made public statements, and took legal actions that kept the case in the public eye, while also keeping the temperature of the public conversation very high. As the Eubanks, by contrast, maintained their belief in their granddaughter's innocence. They grieved her death alongside their grief for Trenton, two losses compounding each other in ways that no family should have to bear. Their position was that Melinda had been hounded to her death by a media machine that had decided she was guilty before the investigation was complete. They filed a lawsuit against Nancy Grace and CNN. The lawsuit alleged that the interview and its aftermath had been a contributing cause of Melinda's suicide. The case was eventually settled. The terms were not disclosed. Nancy Grace herself continued her program and continued to cover missing child cases in roughly the same way she always had. The legal proceedings around the case were not limited to the wrongful death suit. Joshua Duckett, in the years following Trenton's disappearance, was himself the subject of legal proceedings that had nothing to do with Trenton. He was charged and convicted of offenses relating to child pornography and sexual misconduct involving minors. These convictions, which came after Trenton's disappearance, were not directly connected to the investigation into what happened to Trenton, but they inevitably complicated the public picture of the case and the family, and they raised questions that investigators had to grapple with about what they actually knew regarding the people in Trenton's life. The conviction of Joshua Duckett on these charges did not shift the official investigative focus away from Melinda. Investigators had, and have, maintained that the evidence they gathered in the weeks following Trenton's disappearance pointed toward Melinda as the person most likely responsible for whatever happened to him. The inconsistencies in her account, the lack of any evidence of external intrusion, the circumstances of the scene, Melinda's death before she could be questioned further, removed the possibility of a definitive resolution, but it did not, in the view of investigators, remove her from suspicion. But Joshua Duckett's convictions introduced a shadow over the case that complicated any simple narrative about guilt and innocence. Here was a man who had been held up as the cooperating, grief-stricken father, the parent who passed scrutiny where Melinda had not, and who turned out to have been engaged in conduct involving the sexual exploitation of children. And this did not mean he was responsible for Trenton's disappearance, but it meant that the picture of the family was considerably more complicated than the initial media coverage had suggested. And it meant that any confident assertion about what happened to Trenton and who was responsible needed to be held with somewhat more care. The investigation into Trenton's disappearance has remained technically open. The Leesburg Police Department and the Lake County Sheriff's Office have maintained over the years that the case is active, that they have not closed the file, that they continue to follow up on any credible information that comes in. The practical reality of an open case in which the primary suspect is dead and no physical evidence of the crime has ever been recovered is that the investigation, whatever its official status, exists largely in a state of suspension. There are no new suspects to pursue. There is no new DNA to analyze. There is no body that might yield forensic information about time and manner of death. There is, essentially, the original evidence, the scene, the interviews, the inconsistencies, and the silence that has surrounded it since September 8, 2006. Trenton's disappearance became, in the years that followed, a reference point in multiple ongoing national conversations. It became part of the conversation about how cable news covers missing child cases, and specifically about the Nancy Grace model of coverage. The argument that the intense prosecutorial media coverage of Melinda Duckett had driven a young woman to suicide before any legal process had concluded was made repeatedly by media critics, by journalism, ethics scholars, and by advocates who had grown concerned about the effects of this style of crime coverage on the people it targeted. The settlement of the wrongful death lawsuit, while not an admission of liability, was seen by many as at least a partial acknowledgement that something had gone badly wrong. It also became part of the conversation about what investigative pressure on a suspect looks like when it plays out simultaneously in the courts and in the media, and what the consequences of that dual pressure can be. Melinda Duckett was not charged with a crime. She was not arrested. She was a person of interest in an investigation, which meant legally that she had not been found to have committed any offense. She died as a person of interest, and that is the only legal status she ever had in relation to her son's disappearance. What she did or did not do on the night of August 27, 2006, has never been established in any forum that applies the standards of evidence and proof that the justice system requires. There is a particular dimension of this case that deserves careful attention, and it is one that tends to get lost in the noise of the larger controversy. Trenton Duckett was 2 years old. He was a specific child, not a symbol, not a prop in a media controversy, not an abstraction around which adult dramas played out. He was a real boy with dark eyes and Ninja Turtle pajamas who had not yet learned to read, who could not yet tie his own shoes, who depended entirely on the adults around him for his safety and survival. Whatever happened to him happened because the adults who were supposed to protect him failed to do so in ways that remain unclear. Here, the media coverage, with its focus on Melinda Duckett's behavior and demeanor and inconsistencies, and then with its pivot to the shock of her death, spent enormous energy on the adults in the story. Trenton himself, the actual victim, the actual reason any of this was happening, was often reduced to a photograph. That dark-haired boy in the Ninja Turtle pajamas, deployed as a visual anchor for segments that were really about something else. This is not unusual. It is, in fact, one of the consistent failures of the true crime media genre, which often treats victims as catalysts for drama rather than as the center of it. The drama is always the mystery, the investigation, the suspects, the resolution. The victim is the occasion. Trenton Duckett deserves better than that, and attempting to give him better than that means returning, repeatedly, to the fact that he was a child, and he is gone, and he has never been found, and the people who should have protected him did not. The search for Trenton Duckett has never been formally called off. Investigators have searched waterways, fields, and wooded areas in Lake County over the years, prompted by tips that have come in from time to time. None of those searches has produced anything. Central Florida is not a landscape that yields its secrets easily. The terrain around Leesburg is a mixture of subdivisions, agricultural land, scrub forest and water, lakes and rivers and swamps that cover significant portions of Lake County. A body in that landscape, particularly a very small body, in a state where the heat and humidity and wildlife accelerate decomposition, can disappear in ways that make recovery extremely difficult, even when the approximate location is known. If Trenton Duckett's remains are somewhere in that landscape, the odds of recovering them now, nearly 2 decades after his disappearance, are not high. The forensic evidence that might once have told a story about what happened to him has long since been consumed by time in the Florida environment. Whatever physical truth existed in the immediate aftermath of August 27, 2006, is largely gone. What remains is what always remains in cases like this: the testimonial record, the investigative conclusions, the theories, and the silence. The theories in this case have circulated for years in the communities, online and off, that follow it. The theory that investigators appeared to find most credible, it based on their public statements and the direction of their investigative focus, is that Melinda Duckett harmed Trenton on the night of August 27, 2006, disposed of his remains before calling 911 the following morning, and then spent the subsequent weeks unable to maintain a consistent story because she was lying about what had happened. Her suicide in this reading was the act of a person who could no longer sustain the deception and who saw no way forward. A second theory, which the Eubank family and Melinda's defenders have advocated, is that Melinda did not harm Trenton, that someone else had access to the house or to Trenton on that night, and that the focus on Melinda, driven largely by her behavior under questioning and amplified catastrophically by the media coverage, obscured the real answer to what happened to her son. Walk in this reading, Melinda's inconsistencies were the product of trauma, youth, and the overwhelming pressure of a media and investigative apparatus that had already decided she was guilty. Her suicide was not a confession, but a collapse. A third possibility, held by fewer people but not without some basis, involves the complicated figure of Joshua Duckett and the questions his subsequent convictions raise about what kind of person he was and what he might have been capable of. Investigators cleared him relatively quickly in the original investigation, and their conclusions have not publicly shifted. But the discovery that he had been engaging in the sexual exploitation of children, conduct that was apparently ongoing during the period of Trenton's disappearance, is the kind of information that, in another case with different dynamics, and it might have prompted a more searching re-examination of his role. These are theories. They are presented here as theories, and the distinction matters. The only facts in this case are the ones established by the public record. Trenton Duckett disappeared. No one has been charged. No remains have been recovered. The investigation is officially open. Everything else is inference, suspicion, and the kind of terrible speculation that fills the space left by cases that never reach resolution. There is something worth saying about the Nancy Grace dimension of this case that goes beyond the specific controversy. Cable news crime coverage of the kind that Grace pioneered did something to the national relationship with missing child cases that is difficult to fully assess even now. When it made those cases simultaneously more visible and more distorted, it brought resources and attention to some families that genuinely needed them. Cases that might have remained local tragedies received national exposure. Tips came in. Sometimes people were found. The runaway train model, where visibility serves the investigation, is real, but it also created a dynamic in which the investigation and the media coverage ran on parallel tracks that frequently interfered with each other. Witnesses were contaminated by coverage before they could be interviewed. Public opinion formed around narratives that investigators had not yet tested. People who had not been charged with crimes were prosecuted publicly in ways that affected their actual legal proceedings. And occasionally, as in the case of Melinda Duckett, why the pressure generated by that coverage produced consequences that could not be undone. The critics of this model were right. The advocates of this model were also right in their narrower claims about visibility and tips. The truth is that a media apparatus optimized for engagement and viewership is not the same thing as an apparatus optimized for finding the truth, and the two purposes come into conflict in ways that have real costs. Trenton Duckett was one of those costs. He was 2 years old in August of 2006. He would be 20 years old now. He would be in another world a young man, probably finishing college, or working, or figuring out the particular tangle of early adulthood. He would have had his father's features perhaps, or his mother's eyes. He would have grown out of the round-cheeked toddler he was and become something more angular and complicated, the way children do as they grow. He never got to do that. What we can say for certain about Trenton Duckett is limited but important. He was real. He was a child who was loved at minimum by his great-grandparents and by his mother, whatever the truth about her role in his disappearance may ultimately be. He deserved to grow up. He deserved the protection that the adults around him failed to provide. He deserved an investigation that prioritized finding him over finding a narrative. He deserved a media environment that treated him as a child rather than a story. He deserved better than he got. In almost every dimension, he deserved better than he got. And the case of Trenton Duckett is sometimes grouped with other high-profile Florida missing child cases from the 2000s, Kaylee Anthony, Hallie Cummings, as part of a specific regional and temporal cluster of cases that attracted enormous media attention and that share certain characteristics. Young children, young mothers, chaotic domestic circumstances, investigations that move quickly into the media glare, outcomes that were ambiguous or unsatisfying, or both. What these cases share, beyond their geography and their demographics, is the particular pain of unresolved child deaths. Cases where children are gone and no one has answered for it. Cases where the public is left with what it thinks it knows and what it cannot prove. And where that gap between the apparent truth and the provable truth becomes the defining feature of the story. The American criminal justice system is built around the presumption of innocence, around the requirement of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, around the principle that it is better to let 10 guilty people go free than to imprison one innocent person. These are principles with real moral weight, and they exist for reasons that are defensible even in cases where their operation produces outcomes that feel deeply unjust. But there is a specific agony in a case like Trenton Duckett's, where a child is gone and no one has answered for it, and the legal system, operating as it is designed to operate, cannot provide what the victim's family and the public need. There is no trial. There is no verdict. There is no sentence. There is no moment where the truth is spoken in a room with formal rules about what counts as evidence, where it has to be tested and challenged and ultimately found sufficient. There is only an open case file, a little boy in Ninja Turtle pajamas, and the years passing. The reward for information leading to the location of Trenton Duckett has been offered and reoffered over the years. His case remains in the National Missing Children databases. His photograph, that dark-haired toddler, sometimes smiling, sometimes looking directly at the camera with an expression of uncomplicated openness, still circulates. Investigators in Lake County have said over the years that they continue to receive tips. They have said that they continue to follow up on those tips. They have said that the case is active. What they have not said is that they are close to an answer. What they have not said is that they expect the answer to come. What they have said, in the careful language of investigators who know better than to promise what they cannot deliver, is that the case is open and that they have not given up. That is both more and less than the people who love Trenton Duckett need to hear. The Eubanks, Bill and Carol, Melinda's grandparents, have had to carry a grief that is almost incomprehensible in its complexity. They lost their great-grandson, then they lost their granddaughter. They have spent the years since defending Melinda's memory against a public narrative that holds her responsible for Trenton's death, without the ability to prove that she wasn't, and without the ability to prove that she was. They have lived in the space between those two impossibilities for nearly 20 years. There is no version of the story that ends cleanly for them. Even if Trenton were found, his remains somewhere in the Florida scrub or the bottom of a lake, and even if that discovery allowed investigators to determine more clearly what happened to him, the woman who might have been able to provide the answers is gone. She died before any of those answers could be forced out of her. The truth, whatever it is, went with her. This is one of the ways in which this case is unique among the cases in this series. In most cases, the question is whether justice will come. The hope, however fragile, is that a confession will emerge, or a break in the evidence, or a new forensic technique, or a witness who finally decides to talk. In the Trenton Duckett case, that hope operates under an additional constraint. Even if new evidence emerged tomorrow, the primary suspect, the person whom investigators believe was most likely responsible, cannot be prosecuted. She is dead. Justice, in the conventional sense of a trial and a verdict and a sentence, is not available in this case, even if everything the investigators believe is true. What remains available in theory is the recovery of Trenton's remains, a location, an answer to at least one of the questions that his family has been asking for 20 years. Not the full truth of what happened, and not anything that looks like justice in any satisfying form, but at least the end of the particular torment of not knowing where he is. For the family members who are still alive and still waiting, that would be something. It would not be enough, but it would be something. Before we go, I want to say his name, Trenton Duckett. Born April 13th, 2004, in Leesburg, Florida. 2 years old at the time of his disappearance. Dark hair, dark eyes, round cheeks, and a pair of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle pajamas that he was wearing the last time anyone can confirm they saw him alive. He would be 20 years old now. He has never been found. Cases like this one don't end because someone decides they're over. They end because someone who knows something decides that silence has cost too much. That moment hasn't come in Trenton's case. We are still waiting. His name is Trenton, and we will not forget him. Thanks for being here and for listening. Don't forget to hit the bell for our latest stories. Stay safe and take care of the ones you love.